Hey everybody, it's Pastor Mike. Hope you're doing well on this Thursday. It's 5 o'clock. Beautiful but chilly day outside. Here I am again. So glad to connect with you online through Facebook, through this live cast on Facebook Live. So today we're going to talk about the worst piece of advice I ever got. And actually, to put it directly, the worst piece of advice I ever indirectly gave. And we're going to talk about holy sorrow. We'll talk about that in a moment. And if you have questions or comments, certainly feel free to post them. And as I'm able to see them, I'll answer them as I'm able to do so as well. So, with that said, first and foremost, I also have a special announcement for everybody about Sunday morning worship. I'll just do that right now before I forget it, because I was thinking if I should put it at the end, I might forget it. So I'm going to tell you right now. So what we're going to do for Sunday morning worship this Sunday is we're going to have the same worship service with the same links on our stlukeColumbus.com website, and you can always access those. And you can go to the website and it says online worship. You click on that for traditional at 9 o'clock, contemporary at 11. That's normal. That's going to stay the way it is. We're going to add one more thing to that for an option for people. If you want to have an interactive experience for worship, you can click the interactive online worship experience. I think that's what it's going to be called. But to look for the word interactive, it's going to be a different square button on the website at stlukeColumbus.com for both the traditional service and the contemporary service. So if you watch that service live at 9 o'clock for the traditional, 11 o'clock for contemporary, you can click on the interactive one, and you can then interact. It's literally what it is. You interact with people who are also watching with you. And so I can't explain it that well. You just have to experience it. So if that appeals to you, if you think that'll enhance your worship experience on Sunday morning, click on the interactive online worship experience on Sunday at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. Otherwise, just click on the regular one, and you'll just get the online worship experience that we've had the last few weeks. So regardless, you have a choice this Sunday. We're happy to offer that to you. Hey everybody, glad you're here with us, Tara and Melissa. So here's the deal. So we're going to talk about, as I said before, we're going to talk about the worst piece of advice I ever got. And actually, as I said, it might be something I indirectly gave as well. And then also holy sorrow in a minute. We're going to talk about holy sorrow. But, so, the worst piece of advice. And I say it that way, it's kind of, I don't want to be overblown by it, but it's kind of bad advice in some ways. So, it's this. Put on a happy face. Look, I'm all for being positive. I'm all for making the best of things, looking for the silver lining in things. Look, that's what I like that. I look for ways to thrive in this time. Look, I'm not gonna sit and just kind of wonder what's next. I'm gonna, we're all gonna be in this place where we're gonna move in a positive direction forward. But when I thought about that advice, put on a happy face, I thought that's not always the best advice to give anybody, even myself. And I say it was the worst piece of advice given to me, and I indirectly gave, because when I was in high school, I was in the musical Bye Bye Birdie. And maybe you were in a musical like that, or you've seen that show, that musical. I was the character Albert Peterson. And Albert Peterson was a songwriter, a struggling songwriter, and he wrote a song for Conrad Birdie, this major rock star. And Conrad Birdie was going to record one of Albert's songs, but Conrad was drafted to go into the army. That's the story. And so Albert Peterson has to manage this conundrum that his song is not going to be published now by Conrad Birdie. Conrad is so popular. There's all these people that are fans of Conrad, and they're so sad that Conrad is going to be drafted into the army. Well, Albert Peterson, my character, at one point in the show, comes across a little girl who's crying. She's crying because she's grieving the loss of Conrad Birdie. She's sad. She's sad. And so Albert Peterson, that character, the character I played, comes alongside this little girl and says, "Oh, come on, little girl. Don't be so down," basically. "Put on a happy face." Really denying her sadness and just trying to move her out of her sadness because it can't be that dark. And he says, and please, he begs with this girl. Then he begins to sing the song, "Put on a happy face. Gray skies are gonna clear up. Put on a happy face." And then he goes around, he dances around the little girl who's crying, and he's ignoring her sadness. "Put on a happy face. Come on, buck up. It'll be fine." He ends it, and I think it was because Dick Van Dyke did it. I did it. You do this penguin dance to kind of get the little girl from crying, move her from crying to smiling and maybe giggling or laughing, to get her out of the sadness, because sadness is not what we want. And that's terrible advice. Terrible. And I'm afraid that in these days, we're in, I think, week 6 of this self-quarantine. If we're honest with ourselves, sometimes we've struggled, and sometimes we've been sad, and we've maybe not told anybody. And it's been this time has been more difficult than we thought it would be. Or maybe we've experienced the suffering of other people, and we've experienced their sadness by empathizing with them. But then we tell ourselves, "But come on, it's gonna be just fine." I mean, as if we're telling ourselves, "Put on a happy face. You shouldn't be sad." But the reality is, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes this time is really hard. I was just on a conference call, a coaching call with some pastors from our synod, and this one pastor was telling us that, she's an extrovert, and being alone is really, really hard for her, she said. And she's ended up crying sometimes. And you can't deny that sadness. I didn't want to say, "Well, Pastor, put on a happy face because God's in control and everything's going to be just fine. Tie it up with a nice little bow." Ridiculous. Sometimes we just got to be sad and grieve. So put on a happy face it's terrible advice, especially given to people that are sad. And sometimes well-meaning Christians, we do that. We're kind of sometimes like Job's friends. Job in the Old Testament was suffering, and these well-meaning friends were trying to cheer him up. But Job didn't want to be cheered up. He just wanted somebody to understand his sadness. And so we just got to walk with that and walk in that sadness. And so if you're sad today, that's okay. If you're struggling today, that's fine. If you're worried or anxious about today, the next day, that's okay. Be there. It's okay to be in that place too. So don't tell yourself or tell other people, "Put on a happy face. It's going to be just fine." And it might be. But that's not what we always want to hear. And that's a terrible piece of advice. Sometimes I think we paste on smiles. There was I went to this museum in Baltimore called the American Visionary Art Museum, a great museum. If you ever get to Baltimore when this is all over, go to the AVAM Museum. It's artists that couldn't get into the art galleries, the big art galleries. So these are great artists, but they're just not as good as, say, Picasso or Van Gogh or any of these big artists. So AVAM puts their stuff in their museum. And there was an exhibit there when I was there of these pictures, and I think it was video. And this videographer took video of people at the Trevi Fountain in Italy, in Rome, Italy. What was interesting about it was it would start out with these people standing in front of the fountain, and the person taking the picture, which is a popular picture place for tourists. And this person would say, "Smile!" And everybody go, "Yay, smile, we're in Rome at Trevi Fountain." And then the artist, the videographer, took the video and watched as, what was interesting, watched the next moment after the picture was taken. You went from people doing this to, and every single group of people went from pasted on smile, "This is great," to just a normal, drawn face. And sometimes those faces looked sad. It was so interesting. And this time of our life together as a world community, as a Ohioans, people in Columbus, St. Luke, wherever we are, we're in this together. Don't feel like you have to paste on a smile for us. Don't. Because sometimes we don't. We don't want to. And that's fine. If you do, great. If you want to smile today, if you're having a great day, awesome. I'm glad. That I really am. I mean, that's sincere. But if you're not, that's okay too. So, here's the deal. I was thinking about this. That there's so much grief right now in our world, in our country. Think about all of the losses that have been compiling on us as a human community, as the United States. Just take the United States, for example. As of today, 22 million people have applied for unemployment in our country. That's 22 million people who've lost a job. And any loss has grief with it. There have been 33,460 deaths due to the coronavirus in the U.S. alone. 33,000 families, potentially, are grieving the loss of somebody they love. And sometimes they weren't even allowed to be in the same room when their loved one died. We've lost travel plans, vacations. We've lost physical contact with one another, neighbors. We've lost gatherings. So some of us couldn't even gather for Easter. I mean, we gathered as a family, but a lot of people couldn't go to their other places. Sorry, that's the dog again. So those are losses. Some are big and some are small, but there are losses regardless. And we have to recognize that with loss comes sadness. And sadness is grief. It could be small and it could be large, but they're losses nonetheless. What I love about the scriptures is the scriptures are not naive, as one of my professors said. They're realistic. I mean, there's a whole book in the Old Testament called Lamentations that's dedicated to grieving, lamenting, loss. And I love Psalm 137 in that sense. I love it because it's honest. Psalm 137 says, it was written by the exiles as they were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon, and they were away from their homeland. They were away from Jerusalem. The temple had been destroyed. They're grieving the loss of what they had. And Psalm 137 says this, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" They didn't want to betray the sadness that they felt as they were in a new place and waiting for a new day. But in the meantime, they're in this in-between time from where they were to where they're headed, not knowing where they're headed, kind of like us, and they couldn't sing. And the captors are kind of saying, "Come on, guys, sing." I mean, not saying it, but kind of saying it. Put on a happy face. We want to hear a happy song. And the Jewish people said, "No, we're sad." And that's all right. God honors that sadness. And this is where we get to holy sorrow. I think about holy sorrow is that grieving. But before we get to that, let me just say this. Unresolved grief, if we're honest, unresolved grief is a cause for a lot of difficulties for our lives. Some of the symptoms of unresolved grief, that if we have unresolved grief from our past, or if we refuse to grieve and be sad about a loss that we've experienced, we're carrying it around. And it shows up sometimes in anxiety. People who are in addiction sometimes have unresolved grief. That's one of the reasons why they're in this addiction, because they're trying to numb that sadness that they're not allowing to come to the surface. A lasting sadness that won't go away is a sign of unresolved grief. Anxiety is a sign of unresolved grief. Now, if this is where you're at, go talk to a psychologist and help them deal with that unresolved grief. Those are just some of the signs. That I'm not trying to diagnose everything. I'm just trying to give a for instance. But unresolved grief is a problem if we let it go unresolved and refuse to be sad. We just paste on the smile, pretend like everything's fine. Oh, fine. It's so great. Instead, what the scriptures do, what Psalm 137 does, and what God does, he invites us into holy sorrow. He invites us into sadness that's redeemed eventually, but it's sadness nonetheless. And I'm not trying to be a downer here today. I'm not trying to be this, throw a wet blanket on things. If you're having a great day, as I said before, fantastic. I'm just trying to be realistic, because where some of us are not, we're just not talking about that kind of stuff. And so I want to end this time, and if you have a question, I mean, certainly feel free to put that in the chat. I'm so grateful that Paul and Dolores and Jenny and others are here. So glad you're here with us. But in the meantime, I want to share this last thing with you. It's a prayer, and it's from this book called Every Moment Holy. It's a great book if you want to pick up a book of different prayers for different times of life, including like when you're making coffee in the morning, there's a prayer for that. Prayer for changing diapers, that's in this book, and is written by this Anglican priest in Nashville, Tennessee. Great book. And there's a prayer, it's called a liturgy for those who weep without knowing why. And I thought this prayer, this liturgy, speaks directly and indirectly to our time today, and some of us where we are today. So I want to read this for us and pray with this for us. A liturgy for those who weep without knowing why. There is so much lost in this world, O Lord, so much that aches and groans and shivers. For want of redemption, so much that seems dislocated, upended, desecrated, unhinged, even in our own hearts. Even in our own hearts we bear the mark of all that is broken. What is best in this world has been bashed and battered and trodden down. What was meant to be the substance has become the brittle shell, haunted by the ghosts of a glory so long crumbled that only its rubble is remembered now. Is it any wonder we should weep sometimes without knowing why? It might be anything, and then again it might be everything. For we feel this. We who are your children feel this empty space where some lost thing should have rested in its perfection, and we pine for those nameless glories, and we pine for all the wasted stories in our world, and we pine for these present wounds. We pine for our children and for their children too, knowing each will have to prove how this universal pain is also personal. We pine for all children born into these days of desolation, whose regal robes were torn to tatters before they were even swaddled in them. We weep, O Lord, for those things that, though nameless, are still lost. We weep for the cost of our rebellions, for the mocking and hollowing of holy things, for the inward curve of our souls, for the evidences of death outworked in every field and tree and blade of grass, crept up in every creature, alert in every longing, infecting all fabrics of life. We weep for the leers our daughters will endure, as if to be made in reflection of your beauty were a fault for which they must pay. We weep for our sons, sabotaged by profiteers who seek to warp their dreams before they even come of age. We weep for all the twisted alchemies of our times that would turn what might have been gold into crowns of cheap tin and then toss them into refuse bins, as if love could ever be a cast-off thing one might simply be done with. We weep for the wretched expressions of all things that were first built of a goodness and glory, but now their own shadow twins. We have wept so often, and we will weep again. And yet, there is somewhere in our tears a hope still kept. We feel in this darkness like a tiny flame when we are told, Jesus also wept. You wept. So moved by the pain of this crushed creation, you, O Lord, heaved with the grief of it, drinking the anguish like water and sweating it out of your skin like blood. Is it possible that you, in your sadness over Lazarus, in your grieving for Jerusalem, in your sorrow in the garden, is it possible that you have sanctified our weeping too? For the grief of God is no small thing, and the weeping of God is not without effect. The tears of Jesus preceded a resurrection of the dead. O Spirit of God, is it then possible that our tears might also be a kind of intercession? That we, your children, in our groaning with the sadness of creation, could be joining in some burden work of coming restoration? Is it possible that when we weep and don't know why, it's because the curse has ranged so far, so wide? That we weep at which breaks your heart because it also has broken ours, sometimes so deeply that we cannot explain our weeping even to ourselves? If that is true, then let such weeping be received, O Lord, as an intercession newly forged of holy sorrow. Then let our tears anoint these broken things, and let our grief be as their consecration, a preparation for the promised redemption, our sorrow sealing them for that day when you will take the ache of all creation and turn it inside out, like the shedding of an old gardener's glove. O Lord, if it please you, when your children weep and don't know why, yet use our tears to baptize what you love. Amen. So, this is why I say holy sorrow, because as the writer put, an intercession newly forged of holy sorrow. So, my friends, be blessed today in sadness, if that's where you're at. God is right there with you and walking with you in that time, and walking with all of us through this time. We're going to talk about on Sunday how God dwells with his people as we wait. It's a beautiful thing that God's not absent from us. God is fully present with us in the resurrection by the Holy Spirit as we are in this waiting time, as we're in this sad time, a grieving time, and sometimes good days as well, certainly. But God's in all of that and with us in that. All right, my friends, any questions that have come? Nope. But so glad that you are here, and so glad we can be together today on this Thursday. And I hope this has been helpful to you, and hopefully has been a blessing. That's my hope, and I mean an encouragement to you as we continue together down this journey together. So thanks so much for being here, and I look forward to talking again with you soon. My friends, take care. Bye-bye.